Well, it is 9 o'clock. So welcome everybody to our webinar for this morning. This morning we have Marianne Dyrud, who will be talking, as you can see, about lead, and she's put in brackets, serving with a limp. And Marianne is the Executive Secretary of the Norwegian Union. So Marianne, over to you, and blessings for today.
Thank you. Good morning. I would just like to tell you to start with this morning that I come from a strong family tradition of limping people. My maternal grandfather, as you see on the picture here, he traveled young and adventurous to the US at the tender age of 17. In 1922, actually, to Brooklyn, New York to work in construction. He had probably no idea that his stay in the US would change him forever after a fall from a 6th floor on a construction site when he was 20. While he was in the hospital for about 8 months, recovering after his fall with 13 broken bones in his hip and elbow, he had only one thing to read, more or less, his Norwegian Bible, and found that there was more to the Bible than he had known before. He eventually found the Adventist church and became an Adventist. With a shorter right leg, severed hip and elbow, and in the hope that his fiancée in Norway would still marry him, he went home, got married, and fathered 10 children. My grandfather lived all his adult life with a pronounced hip limp and quite a lot shorter right leg. But that did not hinder him in enjoying life and service through his work as a carpenter, furniture maker, and a church member. I have fond memories of my grandfather, and he was always serving as an inspiration to me of taking life as it comes and being able to serve. My father contracted an injury to his back quite young, working as a lumberjack and carpenter with heavy equipment. He went as a patient to our Adventist sanitarium in Norway, Skogli, and my mother, who was working in the dining hall at that time, asked him out on a date, even though she was not supposed to date the patients. So if it hadn't been for my dad's bad back, I would not sit here today. My parents would probably never have met. My dad did not become an Adventist, but served to everyone around him as a shining example of integrity, high values, honesty, and courage, as well as owning a great sense of humor and daring greatly when it came to obstacles and challenges, as you can see. He was 82 on that picture to the left. It's taken at our family farm that we don't own anymore, but where us kids had insisted on getting a lift to get the barn painted, but he insisted on doing it his own way. Luckily for him, none of his children were home at that time. It was a neighbor who took the picture and sent it to my brother. So I continue in the family tradition as I limp as well, not because of an injury, but because of cerebral palsy. I also, when I was younger, had a tendency to forget my physical limitations at times and ended up with a broken leg after jumping on skis, couldn't be any worse than my younger brothers, and broken arm after being convinced at the play area at school needed to be viewed upside down. My cerebral palsy has had the tendency to, well, to a certain point, define what I've been able to do, at least physically, throughout my life. So limping through life is not an unknown fact for me. So I can sympathize with great understanding the title of Dan Allender's book, Leading with a Limp. I think that all of us, though, somehow limp, whether it's physically, spiritually, socially, or psychologically. Because of the world we live in, none of us are spared from some kind of limp. Limping is a part of life, and so we all serve, minister, and lead in a limping world. Let me tell you that even if you limp, in your life, work, ministry, or leadership, God will use you to accomplish amazing things. Actually, when we look at the Bible, we find that there are lots of limping people. Jacob, Peter, Paul, the Samaritan woman at the well, the limping missionary in John 4, and many, many more. limping people are aware of the fact that weakness is a part of life. You cannot avoid your limping, whatever category it is. You minister through it and with it. Somehow your vulnerability and limp makes you strong. And the people we minister to realize that we are human and not superheroes. When we work, minister, and lead through who we are, we become approachable to people. President Teddy Roosevelt once said, "Do what you can with what you have where you are." We cannot erase or take away our limping, our personalities, or our experience. God actually uses us despite of our failings and falls, and from our past experience. He makes us witnesses despite of our limps and stories. Our life is our leadership story. Just observe the woman at the well after her meeting with Jesus. She ran back to the village, forgetting her jug of water, and out of breath, she tells the villagers in John 4, verse 29, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" One of the first limping missionaries for Jesus. Then we have Paul, who was on a different track, so God stopped him with light, where he was blinded to be truly be able to see. He does describe later having a physical ailment problem, but we do not know to what extent or what it was at that time, so we can only guess. He ministered through it and led despite of his limp. One of my favorite leadership books is Robert Clinton's The Making of a Leader. He writes the following, and this has become sort of my mantra for my leadership and ministry. God is quietly, often in unusual ways, trying to get the leader to see what one is. God is concerned with what we are. This is probably why Paul was stopped on the road to Damascus and had to spend some days in darkness in order to see who he was and what God was going to do in his life. Clinton goes on to say that effective spiritual ministry flows out from being and what God is concerned, and that God is concerned with our being. Being, not necessarily all doing. We observe this from Paul's experience, the woman at the well, and Jacob, who wrestles with God in Genesis 32, and as a result, limps his whole life. Ministering through who we are and learning to lead through and despite our experience is a lifelong process. Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book, Always a Guest, points out that what we have, God always multiplies. Just think of the boy in John 6, who came with his 2 fish and 5 loaves to Jesus in faith, thinking that at least he could help a few people on the way. He served with what he had, and God multiplied to feed at least 5,000. When we serve with who we are, even with our limping, God will multiply and use what we have to give. Some of us have scars and limps on our souls, and we may at times feel that we are not good enough to serve, minister, or lead because of our story. But God, he uses us where we are, in who we are, to bless other people. Some years ago, when I worked as a chaplain in our health sanitarium in Norway, actually the same place where my parents met, a patient came in and asked me a question. After he sat down, he confessed that he would not have come in and wanted to talk to me if I had answered differently to his question when he first came in. Sometimes God turns our scars and limps into golden paths and opportunities to show empathy and be a blessing, where we're able to talk and walk with people in a different way than if we did not limp. Brené Brown, in her book, Dare to Lead, she writes the following: living into our values means that we do more than profess our values. We practice them. We walk our talk. Our limping does not necessarily write the headlines in our lives and ministry, but it's important to not have open wounds so we can actually, according to Brown, lead from the heart and not to hurt. This is where we come true and not be manipulative in how we serve God. Being authentic is vital in our mission. We will not be able to attract people to Christ if we're not truly ourselves, living transparent lives and willing to admit that life with Christ does not mean a perfect life. We're human beings and we have a God who picks us up when we fall. I was studying at Andrews University for my BA in theology when a young man came up to me and asked, "Do you study theology?" And the tone in his voice was surprised. When I confirmed that I did study theology, he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye and the following statement, "But you're normal." I'm not sure what that statement said of the impression he generally had of theology students, but I was normal, and it was a good thing to know. At the same time, my view of being a pastor kind of changed. Who did I have to be able to fit in and be abnormal? But most of us have tried probably at some point or the other to fit a mold in some work, or maybe wherever you are. I don't know where you're working, all of you. But we try to dress the part, we try to be a certain way, and just to find out that it doesn't work. Because when we serve in the church, it's not to serve ourselves and a certain mold, but to serve others. And serving within our own skin, we can be more believable in our ministry and leadership. Somehow the people we meet have antennas for fake people, or people who try to be someone else they actually are. The people we do mission amongst want us to be believable and genuine, and know that the picture they see when they meet us is not only surface paint. Dan Allender, in his book, Leading with Limp, says the following: "A leader must first walk into his own narrative. We lead others to God only to the degree that we are aware of how much we flee him, how little we truly desire him, and yet how God is also the deepest, truest, and sweetest desires of our hearts. Leading and serving with a limp means that you can ask people for help. To reach out and ask for assistance and help makes us approachable and believable. It makes it easier for the other person to open up and share. Let me share what Dallin Allender writes about God, how God uses limping people. Here is God's leadership model. He chooses fools to live foolishly in order to reveal the economy of heaven, which reverses and inverts the wisdom of this world. He calls us to brokenness, not to performance, to relationships, not commotion, to grace, not success. To live foolishly in the eyes of the world is to dare to live, and live openly with the facts that we have limps in our lives. This calls for authenticity and in the way we represent the church. When we look at what kind of people surrounded Jesus, they were broken, battered, and bruised, all limping. Also his disciples, they all had some kind of limp. And so we continue in the tradition of limping, living authentically in a world that is desperate to experience the real thing, to meet people, real people who live real lives and not living behind the glossy magazine covered fronts. I have to be honest. At times, it's frightening to serve with the limp. You're vulnerable, open to ridicule and rejection, but also for relationships that would never happen otherwise, because you showed the fact that the church is full of limping people, and we always have room for one more. Dan Allender adds the following: leading with a limp works by inversion and paradox. You're the strongest when you're weak, and you're the most courageous when you're broken. When we look at the Bible, we know that God loves reluctant leaders and missionaries who know that they're frightened, confused, and broken. I don't know about you, but I have said no to a call more than once and told God, may your will be done, but the way I want it. I can assure you that at times God will grant you your own wish. He has done that with me, and it's not ideal. It is when we realize that we are broken, that God can use us the most effective, and most often when we do not realize that he's using us to bless other people. Let us remember that when we're ministering, leading, and serving, let us be open and authentic despite our weaknesses, fear, and brokenness. And let us be true to how God has created us in the way he thought was best. Our individual DNA was exactly how he has intended. So I salute you, people of Limpers. Forget that people are looking at the way you walk, and just start walking and serving in who you have been created to be.
Thank you, Marianne.